Let's review what we know so far about evolution. We know that Darwin and Wallace both came to the same conclusions about common ancestry from their voyages in the 1800s. We also know that scientists before Darwin and Wallace suggested that the Earth was significantly older than previously thought, and that Malthus had suggested that if populations continued to grow, eventually there will be too much competition and some of the population will die off due to lack of resources. Darwin realized that there was a struggle for existence. There are a finite amount of resources that a species can access, and the population will have to fight over those resources for survival. There's even a struggle for existence amongst offspring. When a mother gives birth to children, especially when there are a large number of offspring at once, they have to compete to survive. The phrase survival of the fittest relates to this concept. The majority of offspring will die before getting to reproductive age, so only some members of the population will get to reproduce. When you think of the word fitness, you probably think of someone who works out. But in biology, fitness is a key term we use to describe an individual who is able to reproduce successfully. What about when humans determine how other species reproduce? For example, farmers regularly determine what plants can have the most desirable traits so that they can make their crops better. Another common example of this is dog breeding. Humans have selected dogs to mate based on the desired characteristics that they are looking for. This idea of choosing species to reproduce based on their specific characteristics is called artificial selection. We are selecting what variations are going to be passed on by mating or crossing certain parents. Natural selection, on the other hand, has to do with how fit members of a species are. Those that are more fit are more likely to reproduce and pass on their DNA and genes because they live to reproductive ages. Over time, because only certain traits are getting passed down, the species is altered. We call these different versions of genes and DNA variations, and variations lead to diversity, which is important for a species' survival. When the variations help the individual survive, it's called an adaptation. As certain adaptations are passed on more than others over time, evolution can happen. So natural selection is what leads to evolution. A famous example of this is Great Britain's moths during the Industrial Revolution. Most of the moths were a white color, like the tree that they lived on. That adaptation was the most beneficial to them because they couldn't be spotted by birds and eaten, so they'd live to reproductive age. But the Industrial Revolution's soot covered the trees, so they were darker. The white moths got eaten, and they couldn't pass on their genes, but the darker moths were able to blend in and avoid being eaten. Due to this change, the darker moths were able to successfully reproduce. The variation they had was more beneficial. There can be downsides to adaptations, though, especially when humans are trying to eradicate a species. For example, us humans don't like to have weeds and pests on our farms, so we spray them with pesticides and herbicides. However, some of the species have traits that allow them to live regardless of the poison, so those traits are the ones that get passed on. So eventually, most of the new plants or pests that pop up are going to have DNA that makes them resistant too. In conclusion, natural selection is what drives evolution. Species are in a constant battle to stay alive, and some traits are more beneficial to have. If you have adaptations that will help you live and reproduce, those traits will be given to the next generation, making them better adapted to survive.